presentation is sort of, I think, an effort on my part to cover a very, very vast amount of work in the climate journalism, environmental journalism world. At the same time, I think, you know, because when one takes on such a huge subject, it's important, obviously, to touch all the sort of broad points, but at the same time, provide an opportunity and a forum for interaction with all of you. So at any point, if you have any questions, I'm not monitoring the chat, so someone's gonna likely have to unmute themselves, or maybe Fuller can let me know. But feel free to interrupt me at any point, and then certainly at the end we'll provide an opportunity for ample Q&A, hopefully. So I am not going to speak for the full hour, certainly. So just a little bit about myself. So my name is Sam Ramsey, as was noted on the introductory slide, and I'm a special projects editor at Earth Journalism Network, which is a program of Internews. And Internews, I think probably most of you, or the majority, know, is an organization that's focused on media development around the world and building healthy media ecosystems, information ecosystems. But Earth Journalism Network is a program that's solely focused on environmental journalism. So, our writ is really sort of to increase the coverage, the quality and quantity of environmental journalism, primarily in the global South. There are a few exceptions to that, but 90% of our work has been in the global South. And I come to environmental journalism in a very interesting path, I guess you could say, because I started shortly after college. I interned in a number of media, and then worked, and then left journalism, and actually became an assistant environmental scientist. I worked for California State Parks, including this image that you see here, doing restoration of wetlands. I went to graduate school, focused on environmental science, did a PhD, mostly focused on research. And then at a certain point, I got back into media. Who knows why? I was always freelancing a little bit here and there, but I sort of got back into media full time. And the sense I had was that most of the work that I was doing, at least in the academic world, really wasn't translating all that well to the general public. And so I felt it was really incumbent upon people like me, and certainly, important for our audiences and our publics, to, have a better sense of what's going on both in the world of climate and environmental issues in a general sense, because they seem to be either focused in sort of technical capacities, like people doing wetlands restoration, or sort of the ivory tower in the academic sphere, not necessarily translating out. So that's actually ultimately why I got into this world. And when I first got back into media, it really was sort of exclusively in the environmental area. And at that time, I guess you could say the early 2010s, it was really, I think, the moment, or one of the earlier burgeoning moments, of the international sort of climate justice and environmental justice movement. And that's really, I think, where, to some degree, this whole notion of talking about those parts of the world, those parts of humanity that are most affected by environmental consequences really came to the fore, obviously at international, conferences like the COPs, but also just in general as it became more apparent in news coverage. Not that this hasn't been covered since, the 60s and 70s to some degree. I mean, that's when arguably the environmental justice movement first sort of surfaced, but definitely as the climate movement took off. And so, what I think the broad takeaway from those early days and on to now is that it's really important to keep those parts, those sources, those parts of your story that are left largely uncovered or undercovered. It's important to bring those to the fore in a way that perhaps they haven't really been, at least I would say in the last 40, 50 years of international media coverage. Um, and and the reason that is because climate change disproportionately impacts those communities, right? And that's obviously what the whole environmental justice movement is about. That is those that are least responsible and yet the most affected. And that's certainly the case with climate. Um, and it's also the case that mainstream and legacy media often overlook these voices because they're not either considered particularly profitable or sexy, or in any way, shape, or form newsworthy in the conventional sense. But as I think all of you probably understand, and hopefully by the end of this talk, that it's important to amplify these voices because they are the ones that I think can speak most truly and robustly to the issues that we all face, but certainly as it relates to climate, um, it is a global phenomenon. So let's just talk briefly about who are the margins. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list. Of course, it's impossible to really think about who are within an environmental justice or climate framework who would be the most marginalized. But I think we can broadly say indigenous communities, women, ethnic and racial minority groups, displaced people, other human groups. I think that's a broader category. And then I was going to say non-humans, because I think it's often the case both within a lot of, and maybe this is partly my background in environmental science, but there's a lot of coverage within sort of climate framework and environmental journalism in a larger sense that neglects to cover not necessarily biodiversity per se, although that's often a framework that we think of stories about non-human things, non non-human entities, but non-humans as a way of also understanding what is being marginalized and ultimately what is being affected, and that doesn't necessarily have a voice. And obviously, I think many of you probably went into journalism to give voice to the voiceless. So there is some element of that there. So, as was stated, in the case of climate change, particularly, and you could argue, I think, really in all environmental issues, that the marginalized are those that are affected the hardest and often the first. That is to say, they are, on the front lines. And we often hear this term of frontline communities, that is those communities that are on the cusp of being most devastated or affected by, in the case of climate change, natural disasters, which are very acute, or more longer term trends, such as increased droughts, heat, perhaps in some cases sea level rise. And I think this story that we supported at EJN some time ago is very interesting because it's actually not some time ago, it was this month, but the grant was from last year, was about how women in Sri Lanka's north are increasingly suffering from heat-related illnesses and having their livelihoods affected. And we'll go into more stories like this, but it's sort of a classic story talking about, I guess you could say, again, the more chronic or longer term effects of climate change, not necessarily an individual natural disaster, a hurricane, a cyclone, a wildfire, a flood. These are the things, of course, that often get the coverage in terms of individual events, but these communities that are most affected and most likely to bear the brunt, and in some cases migrate as a result, are often really touched by these chronic issues. It's important within, I guess you can say, the context of covering marginalized communities, that the power of storytelling is indeed a power, and it's something that we should never take lightly as those who are journalists or other members of the media, because it's the way with which we transmit knowledge. Again, I mentioned that whole notion that I kind of left academia and went back into media, and largely in part of this because it is this element of storytelling communication that most appeals and can have the greatest impact on the general populace, right? And our audiences, our readers, viewers, our listeners. And that's because they can shape public understanding, provide empathy, and then ultimately direct potentially policy changes. And that's, again, why many of us went into the media, is to see change, to affect change. at least on some level, even if it's very small. We're not talking, affecting, how the COP proceedings, you know, rewrite global climate legislation, but uh, you know, something very small is also potentially a policy change. Um, and that is something that, most of us, I think, probably would resonate with. Um, and, here's a story again, it's a really relatively technical story in many ways. It's about how, increases in drinking water salinity in Bangladesh have heightened the risk of preeclampsia. For those of you who are not familiar with that, it can be a very, very serious um, uh, prenatal maternal um, disease. Well, it's not a disease, but disorder. And, this has happened because of climate change induced salinity increases. So water is getting saltier in many parts of coastal Bangladesh. And this is having direct effects on maternal health and the health of infants. So, this is just something that it would be very hard to explain, I think, in a medical or scientific way, but is much, I think, easier as a storyteller to link things like the effects of climate change and human health. And obviously, the impacts are far greater when people start realizing that, especially if, individuals who are mothers or who have dealt with issues like this in their own pregnancy. It has a far greater impact than it might in the purely scientific world. Um, it's important specifically as it relates to climate change coverage. I think all of us, and understandably so, get caught up in the large scale major type of stories, right? So if we're talking about the COP, the Conference of the Party conferences that happen every year. This, of course, is a big one that's happening in Brazil this year. Um, or, a publication that comes out with some new record temperature or new really apocalyptic glacier loss statistic or whatever the case may be. These are things, of course, that understandably drive a certain amount of coverage. Um, but in general, most climate coverage centers on policy science and mostly from the global north. And you can see here, this is from the Climate Media Observatory based out of the University of Colorado in the US. And, all this is to say that there's been a general downward trend of at least traditional legacy media coverage of climate change that spiked tremendously during the Copenhagen conference in 2009. And it's, even though there's generally more coverage, um, there's far less, I guess you could say, non non-science and policy coverage than there really should be. And so, again, this is traditional and legacy media, so this doesn't capture, obviously new media, social media related or native coverage, but it nevertheless gives you some indication of what's going on. And part of this is because, as many of you can appreciate, a lot of the stories about climate change are highly technical and they look like this, right? They look like relatively sophisticated graphs. There's a gentleman from Bloomberg Green who, for a living, makes infographics related to climate and economy type stories or climate business type stories. And there's nothing wrong with these. I think infographics are hugely important, and I think this type of storytelling is actually hugely important. But the problem is, I think for many audiences, this is either impenetrable, very difficult to understand, or it leaves out the human element, which is, of course, so much of what the topic of today's discussion is, right? And so this often flies over people's heads, or people just don't absorb this, even though, many of the ways that these infographics relay information are hugely important and maybe quite devastating in terms of their implications, right? So we can think about that for a second. And so what happens is that I think we lose a huge amount in terms of our ability to capture audiences' attentions, our readers and viewers and listeners, by virtue of not providing a human face, and of course, on top of that, specific types of human faces. I did mention that I also think it's important to mention non-humans, and I still maintain that that's sort of my pet peeves is that we need more non-human elements in stories. But human storytelling is essential to what we do as journalists, right? And they, of course, provide and foster empathy and public support for both really any kind of environmental action, but certainly for climate policies. Um, and they emphasize how lived experience bridges the gap between abstract science and real world impact. Covering Climate Now has this kind of slogan, which I think is actually a pretty good one in terms of trying to reinforce what uh, climate journalists should be thinking about every time they tell a story, at least most of the time when they tell a story. And that is a story should solutionize, localize, and humanize. And it kind of speaks for itself, but for those who may be less familiar with Covering Climate Now, I mean, the idea is that if you solutionize, you're more likely to captivate an audience because if, as many of us are turned off by doom and gloom type reporting. Solutionizing a story helps um, at least interest, stoke interest for some segments of the population that are just turned off completely from what's called known as problem-oriented versus solutions journalism, um, sometimes called constructive journalism. But there is this idea that you should localize. So all stories that have some sort of global or in some cases galactic um, ambit really need to have a local context, a local peg, an angle for most audiences. Otherwise, they feel that it's too um, it's too far reaching and amorphous and just hard to grasp. And it's understandable, right? I mean, most of us are just hardwired to be more directly inclined uh, to either provide our energy or our attention to a local context and not to something that's even national or certainly not international in scope. And that's just human nature. And so it's important, if at all possible, to localize your stories. And then, of course, the last one is to humanize, which is, if you're working in a very technical, like I said, policy piece or scientific article, and you don't provide the human element of it, in many cases, definitely for certain audiences, it's just going to be, it'll go over their heads or it'll be absorbed temporarily, but it won't be a story that will have lasting effect. I mean, there's been a lot of research on this, but it typically resonates more with audiences if there's something that a reader, listener, or viewer can say, I can view myself in this circumstance, or a family member, or a loved one, and so it's really important to obviously demonstrate that where possible. I'm doing this to show you how complicated a climate story can be. This is a story about, this is a research article about an Inuit um, population in Northwest Territories in Canada. And, in some cases, you could say it's a relatively small community, so it can't be that complicated. But this research article talks about how the various effects of climate change, interacting effects of climate change on this population. And so, okay, so everything from, the caribou population, which is this, is big game that is obviously very important spiritually, but also as a food source um, for this community. How it's being forced to migrate, it's dying off, and that of course has effects on the wolf population, and then the food effects then have have an effect or a driving effect on household intake of calories, which then has drives further migrations and hunting and so on and so forth. And there's a lot more I'm not going to go into, but the point being is that this is a relatively, in quotes, simple example that becomes hugely complicated if you consider all of the different interacting effects from a scientific lens, right? But if you were to tell this story, as I think has been told to some degree, about this, this Inuit community in Northwest Territories that's being affected by the loss of sea ice, the loss of the caribou population, warmer winters, and all of the compounding effects of that, you could do it in a way that doesn't really go, more than into sort of a couple of these arrows here, and what the social health and and obviously what the ecological effects of all the climate change drivers are, right? And so, you don't have to cover all of this, and you could cover some of it in a using audiovisual, using really good narrative structure, and it probably will have a lot more lasting impact on your audience than this, right? That's just, again, basic human information ingestion, especially now because we're all dealing with this phenomenon, what's known as the attention economy, right? And very few people are willing to spend very much time on anything. And so the greater the impact through these sorts of channels, the more likely your story um, is to provide some level of change, right? Um, it's also important within stories talking about the margins, environmental stories talking about the margins, um, that one goes into. Sorry, my earphones. Apologies. It's also important that we go into what the costs are in detail. And so for doing this, we must keep in mind that ignoring marginalized voices leads to an inability to really cover that sort of solutionizing part uh, of the framework that I talked about before. So, you know, when we just talk about, uh, I guess what I'm saying is when we just talk about sort of the positives or things the way, and as we might term solutions, as the way people are adapting, providing some resilience. We must also keep in mind what the initial costs are in the first place. Here's a series of podcasts that were done about women environmental leaders, environmental justice leaders throughout Brazil. The whole series, it was a series in which each episode covered a different female environmental activist. And one case was this famous oil spill in the northeast of Brazil that was, essentially it was a hugely devastating oil spill. It was covered up by the previous Brazilian administration, and these fisherwomen were essentially able to, provide a huge amount of community activism, and in effect force the government to be more transparent about the oil cleanup and also about what the costs are, and ultimately seek some level of compensation. But this is a story that needs to be told also from the framework of what the initial costs are to things like the loss of fisheries, the loss of livelihoods for these people. The same thing could be said, a similar story from another in the same episode in this podcast, a woman who was part of a group of crab, I guess you call them crab fisherwomen or crab catchers in this area of mangrove area of Brazil that was also affected by a huge amount of port development and other matters. And similarly, the only way to tell the story faithfully would be to focus on why there's a threat and what the threats are to these mangroves, also to these people and their livelihoods, what the overall effect is, prior to going into why this is an important climate story. So in other words, focusing your lens on these populations, on these communities of people that are directly affected, who have already been historically uh, uh, affected um, and impacted, and why it's, these stories of hope can also emanate, but they have to start from a point of what the initial costs are. So if we focus on sort of different segments of kind of this indigenous, excuse me, on this marginalized group framework, I did mention some of the different kind of focal areas. So, indigenous communities and, in many parts of the world, there's sort of a grouping between indigenous communities and ethnic and racial minorities, or even indigenous communities, ethnic, racial minorities, and sectarian minorities. And, for with good reason, because each country and each region of the world has its own very different, has its different geographic um, context. But, you know, scientific publication, but it's still important to keep in mind that much of the world, much of the world's most biodiverse regions are conserved, or at least part of historically, ancestrally indigenous territory. And within indigenous communities, there is, obviously huge environmental stakes. Many of you are familiar with this idea that, there is an effort by the United Nations and global conservation organizations to conserve 30% of land and ultimately sea by 2030. I think that number will not be achieved for the purposes of conservation. And much of that, in theory, would start with indigenous land. There are a bunch of obviously complicated political issues that relate to that. But the reason is, I mean, it's understandable on some level because much of the world's most fragile and important places are historically parts of indigenous territory. They also are deeply under threat. Obviously, the land loss of land from land grabbing and related threats are 7 times higher, according to the World Economic Forum, the international average. Huge amounts of cultural erosion taking place, and some of the worst forms of climate displacement happen in indigenous territory. And this is an example from a story that was supported in Kenya, about sacred forests, and this sort of a classic example of both issues of land grabbing and cultural loss as a result of uh, of uh, of this expansion of really the plantation. Um, the Let's see if I can. Another important type of story to cover as it relates to indigenous people, if we're going to use this covering stories on the margins type of framework, is that of resilience. This is a story that we supported last year from the Brazilian Amazon. And I think it's a very good example of how stories on the margins can, to some degree, be solutions, but also, um, I guess you could say, contradict or countervail certain narratives, that audiences may have about indigenous people. So in this particular case, it's sort of forest guardians that are in the absence of state assistance and government assistance, and warding off illegal miners and foresters in this indigenous territory. They've banded together and formed their own forms of essentially forest watchers, guardians, and have done so in a variety of very ingenious and inventive ways with very limited technology. And this is the type of story that I think often gets undertold, but was hugely important from an environmental lens. When we talk about um, covering stories on the margins, I always have a little bit of an issue with conceiving of of women as a minority group because the majority of the world's population are women, but of course they are in number does not necessarily relate to political power and their presence and coverage in the media. And so it's of course very important, especially in environmental and climate media, to center a lot of your stories on women's perspectives. There are a number of reasons for this, and it's not just because it's a good thing to do as a human being, which I would argue is sufficient enough. But there are a number of other reasons, of course. You know, climate change disproportionately affects women and girls, amplifying existing gender inequalities around the world, and obviously increases their vulnerability to poverty, issues of food insecurity and health. And women, as many or most of you or all of you know, are in the global south are more dependent on natural resources, but have less access to them. Okay, so that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, making them more susceptible to the impacts of droughts, floods, wildfires, all forms of natural disasters, acute and chronic, and climate events, chronic, and of course, resource scarcity. We did a report at EGN some years ago talking about the missing perspectives of women in the news, and found that, especially in the case of India, which was sort of remarkable, because there are so many obviously important Indian female environmental activists and climate activists, that only 14% of sources quoted in India, environmental stories, were women, which is somewhat remarkable. And so this is something to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about stories from the margins. It's obviously better in the UK, but not all that great either, right? Only 29% of sources quoted in the UK were women. So a lot to be improved in that regard. I haven't seen numbers like this since 2020, so who knows? But I suspect they're not tremendously better. Um, so one of the other things, some of the other things to keep in mind are that traditional gender roles often place women at higher risk of exposure to air pollution. So, for instance, from indoor cooking, stoves, etc., leading to adverse health outcomes such as increased risks of heart disease, so a variety of health consequences. And another thing to keep in mind is that women's responsibilities, at least in traditional capacities, for caregiving and securing household resources means disasters, climate-related disasters, place additional burdens on them. In some cases, forcing women out of the workforce, obviously migration, and in some cases, uh, leaving the family altogether. We did have done a series of stories on air pollution and its relationship to uh, domestic work and certainly in terms of cooking with indoor stoves, which internationally is still a huge problem in terms not only of we often think of it in climate in terms of climate emissions because obviously these are dirty emission sources, but obviously the health effects. So we're talking both in terms of worsening the greenhouse effect and global warming, or as the Guardian calls it, global heating, or obviously the individual health effects of which disproportionately affect women. And you can see this elsewhere too, of course. It's not exclusively in the global south, obviously. Here in the US, where I'm located, a number of stories have been done. I suppose not enough stories about the effects of natural disasters, including in LA, the most recent wildfires had there's it's a very troubling story, essentially that Black women in very poor communities went to get their blood tested post wildfires because of all the noxious chemicals that were being, you know, breathed in and respired. And as a result, it turns out that Black women, especially in these poor communities in LA, had much higher concentrations of lead in their blood. And this is something that obviously exacerbates other health issues. And it's kind of a story that I think most of us would not even think about covering, right? This new site, Afro LA, I think was the first to break it, and it's obviously a hugely important story that I think without sort of covering the margins type of lens would go underreported, if not or just not reported. Um, Another focus, of course, is on displaced people. This is increasingly larger segment of the global population. And it's hard to always say how much climate change is the direct driver of human migration because, as an example here in the US, there's obviously historically there until the last presidential administration here, there was a huge amount of human migration from across the southern border, and it was always difficult to determine from a news gathering sense how much of it was directly climate driven. I mean, obviously that was always the assumption, right? Because of loss of harvests and increased droughts and natural disasters that many of these folks, especially from rural areas in Central America and Mexico, and actually increasingly other parts of South America and beyond, um, were coming across the southern border. But when you would, as a journalist, when you would interview a lot of these folks, they wouldn't tell you directly it was climate change, right? So it always becomes, and there's a lot of research on this, how to measure, whether certain types of human migration are climate driven or not. It often has to be done indirectly, and it's done in a very kind of broad sense. But as a journalist, it's important for you to keep this in mind that you can't necessarily just automatically assume that all human migration is climate driven. At the same time, it is sort of incumbent upon you in your reporting and your interviewing to suss out exactly what are the motivations? And if it turns out to be something like crop loss, or persistent hurricanes, or drought, year on drought, those are types of things that you can indirectly at least include in your story, under a climate lens. Um, so there is something on the order of about 10 million people that have been internally displaced, according to the United Nations. Um, and obviously, this provides all sorts of uh, concerns, because these populations face challenges in accessing basic services, healthcare, housing, and sort of long-term livelihood changes. There's obviously, when we talk about covering for the margins, we often just assume or make this implicit assumption about it affecting the poor. But, environmental stories often have to disentangle what we talk about when we're talking about urban versus rural poverty, and what the effects of certainly climate disasters and climate related issues, but I think really all environmental concerns. So from an urban standpoint, of course, urban populations are more exposed to climate risks like heat, flooding, and poor air due to living in informal settlements, or with inadequate infrastructure, limited access to basic services. But at the same time, since rural populations are more land-based usually, and they're more vulnerable due to dependence on agriculture as their main sustenance, as their main livelihood, and of course natural resources, because they're closer to land, right? Um, at the same time, climate change drives rural to urban migration, particularly. So, generally, more often than not, where people are moving out of rural areas into urban areas because of climate-related concerns, which increases the number of people living in poverty in cities, and therefore exacerbates a lot of the same issues. But this is not to say that these types of stories can be covered in one kind of monolithic way. And we'll provide these slides later, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but um, there's this sort of raging debate, at least in the scientific community, about whether it's advisable to have policies that encourage uh, urban migration versus more rural migration, given the concerns of both obviously natural disasters and issues related to infrastructure and livelihoods. Because on one level, especially in the global south, it's very difficult to absorb large populations of poor and the destitute, at the same time, um, and accommodate from using an adaptation framework and a resilience framework, as opposed to in the rural areas where there may be more access to food and natural resources. But if those are also being compounded and affected by any number of environmental issues, but particularly climate change, then that sort of becomes this endless vicious loop of determining where policies are best laid, for dealing with these populations. But the bottom line is that there is this way of talking about the margins that really should differentiate between the city and the countryside. Um, and of course, there are obviously ways of talking about a lot of these stories that do focus on solutions as well. I do want to keep surfacing this idea of solutions as being important in your storytelling. This is a story that we recently supported about in Bihar, one of India's poorest states, poorest communities, regions, and poorest states. There is this utilization of biomass and solar in very, very low tech, well, comparatively low tech circumstances, to provide energy and energy poor parts of the region, and utilizing biomass, which of course in many cases is agricultural waste, which is, for instance, sugarcane, bagasse, or any number of crops can essentially when they're no longer edible or they no longer provide sustenance, can be used as energy sources. And I do, like I said, I would mention this. It's important to talk about the non-human entities, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, these things often don't get covered, so they are in some sense marginalized. And you know, I think from a standpoint as a journalist and not as a scientist, it's really difficult, really difficult to cover stories of things that can't provide you an interview, um, or um, you know, don't reasonably fit into our boxes about, you know, the types of people that we consider to be sources. And so I understand why these stories are often really challenging to tell. They often depend on experts or researchers or scientists or NGOs or, you know, maybe certain government officials. And that is also something we want to avoid to some degree as well. So it often requires some innovative and creative thinking as to how to tell these stories. Um, you know, whether it's from the perspective or about non-humans in a way that also provides them some justice, I guess you could say. As we all know, climate change leads to habitat loss, uh, an increased frequency of natural disasters, making certain parts of the planet really uninhabitable for life, whether it's human or not. And you know, wildlife is forced to migrate, faces declines, extinctions, in the same way that it always has, but exacerbated more so by intensive human activity and, of course, man-made climate change. Um, and you know, increased human-wildlife conflict arises as both compete for dwindling resources. So this is the way of telling stories about how humans and non-humans actually interact and are, you know, um, part of the same, facing the same consequences. So there is a way of providing human source in those types of stories. Um, but you know, ultimately, there are other issues such as deforestation, pollution, and all these matters that affect individual species, and then ultimately have compounding effects on humans. And that's always another way too to, if you really must, and certainly you could argue, humanize every story, that you would bring that in there too, even if a story that you were covering didn't focus exclusively on people. So let's get my time check here. Um, I'm going to try to go through this last part a little bit quickly so that we get to questions. But so yeah, so why are these stories missing? I mean, 22% of climate coverage references community colleges. This is from a report well, a series of reports really that have come out recently, including two that we've supported at UJN, and stories that reference equity and justice appear in only about 6% of news articles that were surveyed globally. You know, this of course doesn't include old languages. That's would be relatively impossible, even with AI. um, but uh, but this is something that sort of a survey um, um, across the world, but primarily in larger languages. Um, and marginalized groups are often portrayed as victims, not leaders or innovators. And obviously, lack of access, language barriers, and mistrust of media hinder authentic storytelling. And this is something, of course, the Solutions Journalism Network emphasizes. So it's really important to find ways of telling these stories to surface the marginalized, but also tell them in ways that are not overly technical and you know, utilize creativity and innovation, whether it's maps, um, rethinking how sources and subjects are in your storytelling. So focusing on community leaders as heroes, not victims, building authentic relationships with your interviewees, and highlighting complexity, resilience, and joy, not just sort of the suffering and the victimry of populations. This is a story from Manga Bay recently that talks about how a young beekeepers initiative brought hope and profit in Sierra Leone. It's a very good story, and it could easily focus on a completely different story about the destitution, the poverty of this community in Sierra Leone, and their inability to scale, certain enterprises. But that's not what the story focuses on. And it obviously has both a climate and a biodiversity lens, talking about bees um, and other climate related issues, and obviously about this community empowerment. In order to do these types of stories, it's really important to obviously build trust, have cultural competence and respect, um, if you're focusing on stories on the margins. I think probably all of you know that, but especially for stories about populations that are historically aggrieved and have gotten historically little coverage in the media. This is particularly important. And, I think a lot of you who have been exposed to trauma-sensitive reporting or the notion of really, really establishing clear empathetic relationship with sources is a key to better storytelling anyway, but particularly in these types of circumstances. We recently supported a series of podcasts in the Philippines, and these stories were told over, I think, over the course of 2 years, really, and really involved almost sort of an ethnographic kind of approach of, staying with these fisher folk communities in an island in the Philippines, and really try to get their sense of how climate-induced losses to their fish populations and their fishing habits, as well as to the island wildlife, were hugely devastating. And again, it seems to have had some measure of audience appeal. If you look at these, these impressions and social media reach analytics. As mentioned, I think it's really important to take this in-depth approach. And in Central America, with the mosquito people, there's this use of ethnography as a way of telling stories that would otherwise not be told. I think that's something that should be strongly considered, especially if you have longer deadlines and forgiving editors, or if you're focused on a documentary approach. Collaborative storytelling, so storytelling that includes work with several different journalists across space and time, as we often do at EJN, with a cross-border idea, but also cross-sectoral. So, working with scientists, working with NGOs, working with civic or citizen scientist groups, and not thinking as journalism in this very, very traditional or archaic sense of only being members of the media that are telling stories, but working with others in pursuit of storytelling. So to my takeaways, or hopefully some of your takeaways for this discussion would be, it's really important to lay the groundwork for all your storytelling. You're just focusing on populations at the margins, people at the margins, sources at the margins. It's really important to get people on the ground to tell their own stories in their own words. And it is ultimately essential, at least in some of your storytelling, to focus on solutions and not just the victimhood related concerns. If you work with indigenous populations, there's a great framework from Agencia Pública from Colombia, which this is in Spanish, but there's an English version of this that talks about how to tell stories that are meaningful with indigenous populations from their perspectives, that utilize their worldviews in part in the journalism that you do. And it's always important to look for unconventional sources. So, if you're, as you can tell that story about where are the women in the news in India, where there are only 14% of women that were in climate and environmental stories, focusing on stories that are not sources that are not getting exposure, and really surfacing them as much as possible. So women, youth, elders, local leaders, all these that tend to get short shift in a lot of our storytelling. So here's a story, for instance, from Kenya that utilized a lot of interviews with school children, which of course is an ethical issue depending on where you report, whether you can interview children. But nevertheless, in this case, interviewing school children that are, using a bus that's no longer diesel powered, and what their perspectives are. And of course, obviously using different forms of media. So photography, video, art. Obviously, I know that Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism utilizes the metaverse and augmented reality and virtual reality. And, I think at the end of the day, storytelling is storytelling. And so, the new technologies that come our way to assist us should be in pursuit of that, right? We shouldn't think of them as being the replacement for storytelling, but rather the vehicle to allow us to enable us to do new kinds of storytelling. So whatever emerges, let's grasp a hold of it, because maybe it allows us to tell stories about people in ways that we weren't able to previously. We've supported people developing video games about environmental stories. A story from Indonesia about the coal oligarchs was told in a Mortal Kombat style video game, was hugely successful in focusing on this issue of coal extraction in Indonesia and the country's dependence on coal in a way that most of our long form stories and others probably weren't all that effective. Obviously, avoid parachute reporting. So don't just go into a place as a foreigner, an outsider, and expect to tell decent stories about those that are marginalized or on the margins. It's important, obviously, to also give back, especially if you're, trying to prevent sort of an extractive journalistic model, right? This is something that's we emphasize a lot at EJN. And this is a story that really did that. It was a podcast about how illegal gold miners in the Brazilian Amazon have essentially hijacked Starlink, Elon Musk's internet satellite system, for their own illicit aims towards deforestation and harming indigenous populations. And this story was retold as a podcast and then ultimately given back as a storytelling session to local folks in this part of the Brazilian Amazon. And ultimately, when we frame our stories, we really have to talk about dignity, agency, and specificity. So when we're talking about stories on the margins, people that are marginalized, we have to always center on some level of dignity and how important their individual and collective dignity is, especially in the wake of a natural disaster such as this, where one's life and livelihood is completely devastated. Perhaps one has lost family members and loved ones, but also about their agency and what they can actually do as individuals and as a community to affect change. So we need to focus on dignity, but also on the agency of individuals and communities to surpass and overcome, environmental catastrophe, and also be very specific about it, not just speak about it in general terms, which is, of course, what, the Solutions Journalism Network and a lot of the solutions folks and the Covering Climate Now folks emphasize too, is, again, for your audiences to really emphasize specificity. And that, of course, means providing evidence for solutions that you put forth, and always never losing sight of that. We can get swept in by telling good news stories, but we really need to provide evidence in order for it to be both captivating for our audiences and our audiences not to feel let down, that they're just being taken for a ride. These are just, for editors, it's important for us to, because I am an editor, of course, I'm speaking from the first person, prioritize stories from the margins in our planning. So encourage our journalists with whom we work to really prioritize this, because we want them to be successful, but also this is kind of the framework for which we want to do our storytelling. And of course, advocate for internal diversity and equity in the newsroom, but also that, of course, diversity in the newsroom begets diversity in coverage, but also equity in terms of the people that we're interviewing and sourcing. And finally, I just say that sort of stories on the margins are central to our understanding and solving many of our, if not solving, at least mitigating some of the most serious harm of the many crises that we deal with, including, and most prominently, the climate crises that we're living through. And amplifying these voices is not charity, rather it's essential for us as journalists. It's for us as a member of, it's our public service, as if you will, as members of the force of state. But it's also important for the present day and for a little future. So I just think about it in those terms, and hopefully you do as well. And yeah, I know I didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A, but I'd like to put it out there.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's really been great. We have a few more minutes in case there are any questions. I think You've exhausted the questions in the chat box, I guess.
Uh, I have not had a chance to look at them because I was the way
Okay.
that my presentation was set up. So I can look at
I'll just,
these unless
yeah,
somebody wants to unmute themselves.
I'll just read them out. I think
Okay.
let me start from the bottoms up. Jacqueline wants to know, to what extent can a journalist infuse indigenous knowledge in writing? Yes, we do. She said, yes, we do not get a body that regulates the same knowledge. And
I'm
Angelique
not
says, how have you found ways to blend scientific facts and still treat the nature-based tactics popular in marginalized communities with the respect and seriousness they deserve?
okay. So let me start first with Jacqueline's. I think I understand this question to speak to you know, internal sort of governance within indigenous communities and how that might relate to exposing indigenous knowledge and storytelling to outsiders. Obviously, this is hugely important. This is something that one must keep in mind. There's international framework, ILO 169, free, informed, and prior consent with working with indigenous communities. That should also apply in storytelling. It's not just for scientists and anthropologists, but rather all manner of working with indigenous communities should require free, informed, and prior consent. And if there's any, considered sacred or spiritual knowledge or consecrated knowledge that can't be exposed to outsiders, that should be respected as a journalist. So, I mean, there's at the same time, all reporters know you work your darndest to suss out information from your sources to the point that you can, and then when you can go to no further, you should probably stop. And that's probably even more. It is certainly more the case with indigenous communities in terms of ethics. Um, in terms of the question from Angelique, uh, so the okay, so the issue of using or being concerned about pseudoscience and the perspectives of indigenous or non-scientific or non-technical approaches to, for instance, climate mitigation or climate adaptation and resilience strategies. Angelique, my approach to that is to not necessarily contradict with, I'll give you an example. So let's say there's this presumption that, you know, building, reforesting with a certain type of tree is important to prevent erosion or something like that. And an indigenous community says, well, what we really want to utilize is this other tree that has particular value to us. And it turns out the scientific community says, oh, well, actually, that tree doesn't have the same effect perhaps in this adaptation strategy. And then you have this inherent, contradiction between what technical or scientific folks are saying and what perhaps the local community is saying. So I think my ethical framework on that is to not emphasize the contradiction so much, but rather to say that there are different approaches um, to dealing with a similar problem. And I think particularly with a lot of traditional because at the end of the day, I mean, if you take a stance of like promoting um, rifts or conflict, then I think that does longer term ill towards our practice of journalists being holistic in terms of the sourcing that we do. I would say this, which is there's a really good framework from the IPBES for thinking about different uh, contexts and different values of nature. And it was done by a series of anthropologists in concert with a bunch of indigenous leaders around the world. And the idea is how to evaluate nature beyond just like what we do, especially in the Western world, which is this economic sense, right? It can be valued as whatever many billions of dollars for its, coastal erosion properties or its, cooling effects or whatnot from a climate sense, or you can say from biodiversity sense, it has this kind of tourist value, da da da, so on and so forth. And especially in many parts of the world, there's valuations that are focused on spirituality, that are focused on, ancestral relationships, and a lot of these things can't necessarily be captured in a purely dollars and cents type of framework. So it's important also to, I think, at least in those types of stories, to emphasize that there are, at least I haven't looked at the report recently, but I think there's like, you could say something on the order of 25 different valuations of nature. And they go everything from recreational use and like I said, they're economic. value all the way to, cosmology and spiritual value, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to keep that in there. We have a question from Shirai. How best can we make complex data more understandable in our reporting so that the minority group that we were writing for understand what we communicate? Okay, so I think that's really a media, and I don't mean media in terms of the news media, but like multimedia um, question. So, if you're dealing with a population is that has relatively limited formal education or access to
Mm.
formal education, um, I deal with a lot of have dealt with a lot of populations that were illiterate or functionally illiterate. It's really to find, or maybe not news literate too. There's also that question too, which much of the world is at this point. It's really to devote time and energy to a format that is most um, salient to your population. So I'll give you an example. Um, one thing that happens a lot in the groups that in the Brazilian Amazon that I've worked with in the past is using both photos and video in ways that might be approachable to again to folks that don't necessarily or may not necessarily be literate or don't even access the news at all. Um, some places that have worked with theater have been really successful in telling news stories, like um, you know, translating maybe a very complex long form article into a theater piece. Um, Visuals are always hugely important, and I think there's always this discussion, especially with people that do infographics, um, especially if they're really good, is they really want to put as much detail information in as possible because they want this really sleek and sophisticated and fancy looking visual. But often the case with infographics, the simpler the better. So in many cases, if you're telling a story that involves many different parts, like I mentioned about that story about the Inuit and Northwestern territories, you could include a graphic that had all those different elements, right? About how climate change is affecting those communities. But that would just be overkill. And so you really, elegance is often um, devoted just to a few elements, especially in an infographic. And again, we have to think about our audiences. What is the biggest takeaway you want them to have? And you don't necessarily need them to have, all the takeaways that you'd like, but to have at least one or two, certainly one. And so that's also something to keep in mind. So whatever's most salient to your local audience, you just got to really give it a deep think about that. And an audience engagement standpoint too, even if you do a really complicated story about a population and you're like, you know what, there's no way for me to translate the story itself in a meaningful manner to a local audience, but I can do an audience engagement strategy like an event or a conversation about the story or something that is not the story itself, but is a manner in which you can engage an audience in a more casual way to at least get the information across in some other form. And there's a lot of people thinking about that these days, that sometimes the news story itself is not the most important information vehicle, right? How can one report about climate change impacts on conflict zones, for instance, in Sokoto, Zamfara, axis of northwestern part of Nigeria? I don't know that specific region, but from a larger sense about conflict, it's obviously a big area of reporting, relationship between conflict and climate change, both on the driver, on the input end, on the output end, right? So, climate change with resource scarcity and droughts and natural disasters drives human migration or drives resource conflicts, which drives, human conflict and war. Um, a lot of reporting on that. In terms of the output side of it too, war is a huge environmental disaster. Many of you probably have seen stories, for instance, about what's going on both in Gaza and Ukraine. I mean, the amount of munitions and the emissions from missiles and drones and aircraft. I mean, it's a huge environmental disaster. And of course, explosives material and even things like the amount of plastic that's used in PVC and a lot of war making infrastructure is a huge environmental crisis that I think often gets minimal reporting. So I think it's important, obviously, to think about human conflict, both climate change driving it in many respects, and it can, but also the effects of human conflict are hugely devastating for the environment. So, is there any other questions? sorry, I can't speak specifically to that region because I'm not very familiar with northwestern Nigeria.
Um, okay, I think that's about the last question that we have.
Okay, is there another question from a youngster? Okay, I think that was
Sorry, I have a
a candid mic.
two-year-old here who insists on being part of the workshop.
Well, I'll try to answer a question if he has one.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much,
yeah.
Sam. Thank you
Thank you.
guys for joining us. Sam has graciously shared his slides, so I'm going to be emailing it to everyone. You can check the chat for Sam's email address in case you have any questions or you want to reach him for anything. Feel free to send Sam an email. And if you are connecting with CCIJ for the first time, we appreciate you. We thank you. And we ask that you please follow us on all our social media platforms so that you can be aware of any other thing that we'll be doing. We also have a WhatsApp community. I'm going to see, just give me a minute. Okay, so I'll be posting the links in the chats right now so you can join us on WhatsApp. That way, you can be aware of all our activities, and most importantly, you can get access to every material and opportunities that we share, in the community. And we have our newsletter coming up in a few days. The newsletter for the new month of June will be coming up. And when it does, you're going to get not just the slides, but you're going to get the video recording of this session. So you can always go back and watch it. We usually put our video recordings on our YouTube channel. You can also go on there at CCIG on YouTube so that you can see previous videos of workshops that we've had before. So, once again, Sam, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for those who stayed up to the end and came early. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Dick, Abel. We appreciate you, Ernest, Richmond, Sunny, Yawale Adamu. Thank you so much. And we'll see you again next month.